Inside to Sophie Cunningham, the biggest lead for Indiana.
Gets it to going right.
Women's basketball was supposed to be entering its golden age. Instead, it may be entering a civil war. For years, Aya Wilson stood at the top of the mountain untouched, dominant, decorated, untouchable. Championships, MVP trophies, Olympic gold medals. She wasn't just winning games, she was defining an era. Analysts called her the face of women's basketball without hesitation. Coaches feared her. Opponents respected her. The league itself seemed built around her presence. Then one player walked in and changed everything. Caitlin Clark didn't arrive quietly like most rookies. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't bow to veterans. She exploded into the sport like a cultural earthquake. Suddenly, arenas were selling out weeks before tip-off. Television ratings shattered records nobody thought women's basketball could reach. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game before were suddenly memorizing schedules, buying jerseys, arguing online, and flooding social media with highlights of impossible logo threes that looked more like something out of a video game than real life. Everywhere you looked, there was Caitlin Clark. SportsCenter, Nike commercials, billboards, late-night television, magazine covers, debate shows, social media trends. The spotlight that had belonged almost exclusively to Aya Wilson for years was beginning to move. Slowly at first, then all at once. And according to people watching closely inside the basketball world, that shift changed everything. Because this was never just about basketball. It was about power, about control, about who gets to own the future of the sport. At first, the tension was subtle, almost invisible unless you were paying attention. A cryptic social media post here. A carefully worded interview there. Moments where praise for Clark felt forced. Moments where silence said more than words ever could. But over time, the cracks became impossible to ignore. When Caitlin Clark signed her historic Nike deal, the internet exploded. Analysts called it transformational. Sponsors rushed toward her like investors chasing the future. And while fans celebrated what it meant for women's basketball, others inside the league reportedly saw something very different. A threat, not to the game, to the hierarchy. Then came the magazine covers, the Athlete of the Year conversations, the non-stop media obsession. And suddenly, something uncomfortable started happening. Aya Wilson, one of the greatest players the sport has ever seen, was no longer the center of every conversation. For years, the WNBA had begged for mainstream attention. Caitlin Clark brought it overnight. But attention changes ecosystems. It changes money, influence, status. It changes who people build around. And not everyone was prepared for that reality. Behind the scenes, frustration reportedly started growing louder. Veterans questioned the media coverage. Former players criticized the obsession. Fans divided into camps. Every debate turned toxic. Every interview became political. And every Caitlin Clark headline seemed to ignite another firestorm online. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. League insiders began quietly noticing something else. The public mood was shifting. Fast. Because the more Clark was criticized, the bigger she became. Every cheap shot on the court became a viral moment. Every dismissive comment fueled her fanbase even more. Every attempt to humble her only expanded her popularity. It was no longer just basketball fans watching. It was America watching. And in the middle of all of it stood Aya Wilson, a legendary player now caught in a battle she may never have expected to fight. The problem wasn't talent. Nobody questions her greatness. The problem was perception. Because while Clark represented the future to millions of new viewers, Wilson increasingly started representing resistance to that future. Fair or unfair, that narrative began spreading everywhere online. Then came the whispers. Executives reportedly concerned about branding. Sponsors watching fan reactions in real time. Networks noticing which names generated traffic and which didn't. And suddenly the conversation inside women's basketball stopped being about championships. It became about marketability, visibility, influence, star power, the business of attention. That's when things allegedly reached a breaking point. According to growing speculation online, frustrations behind closed doors boiled over after internal disagreements connected to Team USA discussions and the league's changing landscape. Nobody publicly confirmed the full details, but fans immediately sensed that something bigger was happening beneath the surface. And once the internet senses blood, it never stops digging. Clips resurfaced. Old interviews were reanalyzed. Body language became evidence. Every reaction went viral. Every silence became suspicious. The basketball world turned into a courtroom. And Caitlin Clark remained at the center of all of it. The terrifying part for the old guard is this. Clark's rise doesn't look temporary. It looks seismic. Because she isn't just bringing attention to the WNBA. She's changing who watches it. Young fans, families, casual sports viewers, international audiences. People who never cared before now suddenly care deeply. That kind of influence changes leagues forever. And whether people admit it or not, everyone inside women's basketball understands the stakes. Because history has shown something brutal about sports. When a new superstar captures the culture itself, the throne rarely stays shared for long. The league now stands at a crossroads. One side built the foundation through years of sacrifice, low salaries, empty arenas, and relentless struggle. The other side is bringing unprecedented fame, money, ratings, and mainstream relevance. Both truths exist at the same time. But coexistence? That's becoming harder by the day. And if this tension keeps growing, women's basketball may be heading toward the biggest internal divide the sport has ever seen. Not because of one game, not because of one interview, but because an entire generation is fighting over who gets to define the future. And right now, the future looks like Caitlin Clark. There is a difference between dominance and dependence. For years, the basketball world looked at Aya Wilson and saw untouchable greatness. MVP trophies stacked like monuments, championship parades, Olympic gold medals glittering beneath arena lights, Defensive Player of the Year awards, magazine covers, signature campaigns. A superstar so established that many people stopped asking whether she was the face of women's basketball and simply accepted it as fact. But dynasties become dangerous places when they start believing they are permanent, because permanence in sports is an illusion. And somewhere deep beneath the praise, beneath the trophies, beneath the carefully polished image of stability and leadership, a fear had quietly started growing. Not fear of losing games. Fear of losing relevance. Then came Caitlin Clark. And suddenly, everything changed. Not gradually. Not politely. Violently. Like a tidal wave crashing into a structure that thought it could never be moved. Clark did not just bring scoring. She brought gravity. The kind of cultural gravity that bends entire leagues around a single name. The kind of gravity that changes television contracts, marketing strategies, ticket prices, endorsement meetings, and dinner conversations across America. Little girls started shooting from the logo because of her. Casual sports fans who had never watched a women's basketball game suddenly knew player statistics. Arena attendance exploded. Merchandise vanished off shelves. Broadcasters stopped treating women's basketball like filler programming and started treating it like primetime entertainment. And that was the moment the tension truly began. Because attention is power. And in professional sports, power is never surrendered peacefully. At first, the resistance was subtle. Small comments hidden behind smiles. Vague social media posts. Interviews about earning respect. Conversations about veterans being overlooked. Statements that never mentioned Clark directly, but somehow always circled back to her existence. The old guard understood exactly what was happening. The league they had spent decades building was suddenly orbiting around someone new. Someone younger. Someone electrifying. Someone who was becoming bigger than basketball itself. But here's the uncomfortable part that nobody inside the sport wanted to say out loud. The more people tried to resist Caitlin Clark's rise, the stronger it became. Every criticism created sympathy. Every cheap shot became viral fuel. Every dismissive comment made fans defend her harder. And every attempt to reduce her impact only expanded it further. Meanwhile, another reality was quietly unfolding behind closed doors. One that had nothing to do with social media narratives and everything to do with basketball itself. Because international basketball exposes things domestic leagues can hide. The WNBA rewards stars. FIBA exposes weaknesses. And according to insiders, Team USA decision-makers had started noticing something deeply concerning about Aya Wilson's game when viewed through the lens of global competition. In the WNBA, Wilson's offensive dominance often lives at the free throw line. Drive. Contact. Whistle. Repeat. Night after night. Possession after possession. A rhythm built not just on skill, but on officiating patterns that favor star power and offensive aggression. The league protects its icons because icons sell tickets. That is the business. And inside that ecosystem, Wilson thrived. But FIBA basketball is different. Brutally different. International referees allow physicality that would trigger instant fouls in the WNBA. Defenders body you, push you off spots. Contest without mercy. And officials rarely reward dramatic contact. There are no superstar whistles on the global stage. No reputation calls. No protection. Only execution. And according to people evaluating Team USA, that difference changed everything. Because when the whistle disappeared, so did parts of Wilson's offensive efficiency. Suddenly, the drives looked harder. The rhythm looked disrupted. The frustration became visible. The effortless dominance started looking far less effortless. Meanwhile, Clark's game traveled perfectly. Because you cannot referee away a 32-foot jump shot. You cannot whistle away elite court vision. You cannot neutralize basketball IQ. Clark's offense doesn't depend on contact. It depends on geometry, spacing, timing, vision, fearlessness. She scores from distances defenders are psychologically unprepared to guard. And when physical defenders pressure her, she adapts instead of collapsing. She creates. She improvises. She manipulates entire defenses with one glance. That kind of skill survives in every country, under every rulebook, in every environment. And Team USA coaches reportedly saw it immediately, which is why the roster announcement sent shockwaves through the basketball world. When USA Basketball revealed its roster for the FIBA World Cup qualifiers, one name dominated headlines, Caitlin Clark. But another name was missing, Aya Wilson. At first, fans assumed there had to be a mistake. Then came the explanations. Rest. Load management. Veteran preservation. But people inside basketball noticed something strange almost immediately. Other veterans stayed involved. Some attended camps. Some mentored younger players. Some remained visibly connected to the program. Wilson reportedly disappeared entirely from the process. No leadership role. No mentoring presence. No visible collaboration. Nothing. And behind the scenes, according to growing speculation, the reaction was explosive. Because for the first time in years, Aya Wilson was forced to confront something terrifying. The machine no longer revolved around her. The future had started moving in another direction. Fast. Phone calls were allegedly made. Questions were reportedly asked. Frustration spread through inner circles trying to understand how the face of the old era suddenly found herself outside the center of the new one. But while chaos brewed behind the scenes, Clark was in Puerto Rico doing something devastatingly simple: winning. After months away from competitive basketball because of injuries, many expected rest. Instead, she returned looking even more dangerous, sharper, smarter, more composed. And in her first senior national team appearance after nearly 8 months away, she delivered a performance that stunned even longtime analysts. Assists flying everywhere. Deep threes splashing through nets. Defenses collapsing in panic every time she crossed half court. The offense transformed the second she touched the ball. Not because coaches forced it to, because basketball itself bends around players like her. Across the tournament, Team USA dominated opponents. And at the center of it all stood Caitlin Clark, orchestrating everything like a conductor controlling an orchestra. Then came the final blow. Tournament MVP. Not hype. Not internet popularity. Not marketing. Performance. Cold, undeniable production on the international stage. And suddenly, The conversations inside women's basketball became impossible to ignore anymore. Because this was never only about talent. It was about evolution. One generation built the foundation through sacrifice, low salaries, empty arenas, and relentless struggle. Another generation arrived carrying unprecedented attention, money, visibility, and global reach. Both truths matter. Both deserve respect. But sports history has always been ruthless about one thing. The future does not wait for permission. And perhaps the most damaging part for Wilson was not being left off a roster. It was what the situation appeared to reveal about perception. Because Team USA is not only selecting talent, it is selecting emotional stability,
chemistry,
leadership, composure under global pressure. The Olympics magnify everything. Every eye roll becomes a headline. Every emotional reaction becomes international news. Every locker room tension becomes dangerous. And according to critics, Wilson's public frustration over Clark's rise started creating questions coaches could no longer ignore. Questions about ego. Questions about resentment. Questions about whether personal emotions were beginning to interfere with team culture. The breaking point reportedly came after Wilson publicly discussed the history of black women in the WNBA during the height of Caitlin Clark mania. Now, the core message itself mattered deeply. Because the history of the WNBA absolutely was built on the labor, sacrifice, and brilliance of black women who carried the league for decades when mainstream America barely paid attention. That truth is undeniable. But critics argued the timing and framing transformed an important cultural conversation into something that felt personal. Especially because Clark herself repeatedly credited the women who came before her. She praised pioneers, named legends, acknowledged history, yet the divide kept growing anyway. And for Team USA officials reportedly evaluating chemistry and public pressure, that divide may have raised alarms. Because international basketball is not just about surviving opponents. It is about surviving scrutiny. The cameras never stop. The expectations never disappear. One emotional fracture can poison an entire Olympic run. And according to growing speculation, decision-makers decided they could not risk instability during a transitional era this massive. Which brings us to the terrifying question now hanging over women's basketball. Was this simply a basketball decision? Or are we witnessing a complete transfer of power happening in real time? Because dynasties rarely collapse all at once. First comes tension, then insecurity, then public fractures. Then the moment everyone realizes the future has already arrived before the old era is emotionally prepared to let go. And right now, whether people inside the sport want to admit it or not, the future looks increasingly centered around Caitlin Clark. But the deeper the story goes, the less it starts looking like ordinary basketball politics. And the more it starts looking like a league caught in the middle of a generational takeover nobody knows how to stop. Because behind the highlights and headlines, something far more uncomfortable was unfolding inside women's basketball, a battle over ownership of the spotlight itself. For years, the WNBA operated within a carefully controlled ecosystem. The stars were known. The hierarchy was understood. Veterans carried authority. Media coverage moved in predictable patterns. The culture inside the league valued loyalty, patience, and respect for seniority above almost everything else. Then Caitlin Clark shattered the structure overnight. She arrived with an audience larger than the system itself. And that changes everything. Because when an athlete becomes bigger than the machinery surrounding them, the machinery begins to panic. Television executives noticed it first. Games involving Clark were producing rating spikes that looked almost unreal compared to previous seasons. Road arenas started relocating games into larger venues just to handle demand. Secondary ticket markets exploded. Sponsors who had barely glanced at women's basketball before suddenly started fighting for partnerships. Entire broadcast schedules shifted around one rookie. Not a champion. Not a veteran. A rookie. That kind of disruption creates excitement publicly, but privately, it creates fear. Because sports leagues survive on balance. And balance was disappearing fast. Inside front offices, difficult conversations reportedly started taking place. How much of the league's future should revolve around one player? What happens if every broadcast, every commercial, every social media campaign becomes centered around Caitlin Clark? What happens to everyone else? And perhaps most dangerously, what happens to the players who spent years building the league before Clark ever arrived? That emotional tension spread everywhere. Some veterans tried to embrace the moment publicly while struggling with it privately. Others resisted more openly. Fans began splitting into factions. One side argued Clark was saving women's basketball financially and culturally. The other side argued the media was erasing decades of history to manufacture a single superstar narrative. Every conversation became radioactive. Every debate became personal. And through all of it, Aya Wilson increasingly found herself positioned as the symbolic face of resistance to the Clark era. Fairly or unfairly, that perception alone changed everything. Because modern sports are no longer controlled only by performance. They are controlled by narrative. And once a narrative hardens online, reversing it becomes almost impossible. Suddenly, every Wilson interview was dissected frame by frame. Every expression became evidence. Every social media post became proof of hidden resentment. Fans analyzed body language like detectives solving a crime scene. And the internet did what it always does. It turned tension into mythology. But then came the moment that reportedly terrified league insiders the most. The realization that Caitlin Clark's popularity was not slowing down after the initial hype cycle.
It was accelerating.
Usually sports phenoms cool off after the novelty fades. Clark did the opposite. The more pressure she faced, the bigger she became. The more physical defenders played against her, the more audiences rallied behind her. The more critics questioned her legitimacy, the more supporters defended her like a movement instead of an athlete. That is when the situation stopped looking temporary and started looking historic, because leagues can manage stars. What they cannot easily manage is cultural obsession. And Clark was becoming exactly that. A cultural obsession. Children copying her shooting form. Families planning entire weekends around her games. Celebrities showing up courtside. Sports media reorganizing coverage priorities around her existence. Even international audiences who had never cared about the WNBA suddenly knew her name. At that point, the power dynamics inside women's basketball fundamentally changed forever. And according to critics, Aya Wilson sensed it before almost anyone else. Which may explain why the emotional undertones surrounding Clark allegedly grew sharper over time. Because Wilson was not just competing against another player. She was competing against inevitability. And inevitability is terrifying in professional sports, especially for athletes who spent years at the top. History shows this pattern over and over again. The aging superstar sees the next era arriving long before the public fully understands it. They notice the cameras shifting, the sponsorship meetings changing, the reporters asking different questions, the attention slowly drifting elsewhere. And psychologically, that transition can break even legendary athletes. Not because they are weak, because they are human. But according to growing speculation, Wilson made one catastrophic mistake. She appeared to personalize the rise of Caitlin Clark instead of adapting to it. That decision may have altered how decision-makers inside Team USA evaluated everything moving forward. Because elite international programs care about one thing.